Hey guys, have you heard of Goldbelly? It's this amazing site where they ship the most iconic, famous foods from restaurants across the country, anywhere, nationwide. I've never found a more perfect gift than food. They ship Chicago deep dish pizza, New York bagels, Maine lobster rolls, and even Ina Garten's famous cakes. So if you're looking for a gift for the food lover in your life, head to goldbelly.com and get 20% off your first order with promo code GIFT.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
See it, say it, sort it.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
In movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, it's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, it's given away by the title, really. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, behind-the-scenes stories, all the ingredients, really, that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast, they lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try really hard not to do snark. I try really hard not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and a real appreciation of just how hard it is to get a movie made. In each episode of Film Stories, I tend to focus on two different films and tell you their tales, and I'm going to crack straight on with the first of them now. As always, I'm going to set this up with a clip from the trailer, and I'll come to the story the other side of this.
I hoped today might be a good day. Hope is a dangerous thing.
You have a brother in the 2nd Battalion.
Yes, sir.
They're walking into a trap. Your orders are to deliver a message, calling off tomorrow morning's attack. If you fail, it will be a massacre.
Let's talk about this for a minute.
Why?
We've got orders to cross here.
That is the German front line.
If we're not clever about this, no one will get to your brother. I will.
That then was a clip from 1917, dating back to 2019. Quite confusing to say that. Written by Sam Mendes and Christy Wilson-Cairns, directed by Sam Mendes and starring George Mackay, Dean Charles Chapman, Mark Strong, Andrew Scott, Richard Madden, Colin Firth, Benedict Cumberbatch in the growing ensemble for the film. And so, for the story of 1917, let's go back to 2015, which was when Sam Mendes concluded his adventures in the world of James Bond 007. That Mendes had directed Skyfall in 2012 and then Spectre in 2015. And it became quickly known after Spectre that Mendes had no intention of returning to the world of James Bond. Spectre had been quite a tricky film to make. It had gone into production without a last act that really worked. If you had been slightly churlish, you might suggest it ended production without a last act that really worked. And it just bore some of the scars of the problems of making it when the final film was put onto screens. So Mendes threw himself back into theatre work for a while as he began to work out what his next film project was going to be. Now, by 2017, he was directing The Ferryman on the London stage, and he also had a child on the way as well. And it was around this time that he was working on the screenplay for what would become 1917, working with Christy Wilson Cairns. Now, she'd worked at this stage with Mendes' production company, Neal Street Productions, on a film adaptation of a completely different story, the book The Voyeur's Motel. And the idea was that Mendes would then direct that as his next feature film. However, the subject of The Voyeur's Motel also became a documentary, and when Mendes got wind of that, he backed away from doing a narrative feature film based on it and started to look elsewhere. And he looked into the past, a key influence being Alfred Mendes, his grandfather. And his grandfather had once told him a story about being a messenger for the British on the Western Front during World War I. And so in 2017, he was just starting to scribble some notes down. Now, he talked about the process of what came next in an extensive interview with The Hollywood Reporter. And he talked about just after the birth of one of his children. He said, "I didn't want to leave the house because those are the precious weeks and months." So he said, "So I thought I'd occupy myself by reading and writing." And by the start, early 2018, he'd done enough reading and writing to produce 20 rough pages that would be the guts of a World War I movie with a degree of real time to it. He just had 20 rough pages. He didn't have an awful lot else. But then he decided to bring in help. And so he enlisted Christy Wilson Cairns. He'd worked on Penny Dreadful, the series that he produced for Showtime, and Christy Wilson Cairns had worked on that as well. And so the thought that Mendes had that really sparked this was, why don't we lock the audience into the men's experiences in a way that feels completely unbroken in a movie that resembles a ticking clock thriller in which we experience every second passing in real time? Could he make a film like that? And he said it seemed a natural way of telling the story, albeit difficult. Now, he deliberately sought out a female writer to do this because he knew otherwise this was going to be a very down-the-line masculine story, and he wanted a different perspective on that. And so Christy Wilson Cairns then spent weeks digging around in the Imperial War Museum in London. She dug out diaries and letters and was reading diaries and letters that were written during World War I from troops in the trenches during the war. She took a tour of northern France. She went to visit cemeteries. She saw where soldiers were buried. She also went back to the 1929 novel All Quiet on the Western Front that's inspired a couple of films as well. And by April of 2018, she had a working screenplay that they could take forward. Still, there was a bit of work to do because they developed this independently, away from studios, away from production companies, apart from their own putting some money in. And so the idea was that Sam Mendes would direct this, a script was in place. And so in June 2018 came the news to us on our side of the fence that this was happening. And the idea was that he would take the package to market to try and secure a worldwide distribution deal for the film that would also cover the cost of production of it as well. And so in came Amblin, Steven Spielberg's company, and Spielberg had worked with Sam Mendes on his first movie, American Beauty, that was made for Spielberg's then company DreamWorks. And Amblin struck a deal to back the film, also including the US release right. It was quite competitive as well. Paramount was interested in the film, Sony, New Regency also were in the running. But in June of 2018, what we weren't getting were real story details. We knew the basics, that it was a World War I movie, but we didn't know much else beyond that. We were told that it was going to be filming in April 2019, but here's the thing, it was going to be in cinemas in December 2019. So that's 8 months from the start of production, it was going to be in cinemas. That's a staggeringly quick turnaround and one that quickly raised some eyebrows. Now, I say that factoring in that Mendes' Bond films had 3 months of post-production, and that was your lot. But even so, in the case of this particular project, to have a film in cinemas, 8 months after the start of production, that was incredibly quick. And so there must be something about the film that made that feasible. Well, of course, we know now what that idea was, that it was going to be the idea of a story told in basically one or two shots, something that had come to Mendes during his 2015 James Bond film Spectre, which opens with an 8-minute opening sequence in Mexico City. And it was that kind of triggered this idea in his head. Still, going back to the deal that was struck for the distribution, and Mendes just said, I couldn't be happier to be back working with Amblin and Steven Spielberg again. He said, I've been working on this script for over a year, so it's very exciting to start making the movie itself a reality. Spielberg chipped in as well. Our company's been a home for Sam since his first film. I'm so happy to have him back here in his old room spinning new stories. And here's what Spielberg said, especially this hugely daring and ambitious new movie. Now, that's usually just press release talk, but again, Spielberg knew something we didn't. This was going to be effectively a 1 or 2 take movie, a 1 or 2 shot movie. For production designer Dennis Gassner, working again with Sam Mendes, I mean, there was a kind of, how on earth are we going to do this? Because Mendes brought together his key team. Gassner was one of them. Roger Deakins, cinematographer, was another. And as Gassner said, it's a big ask, a big story to tell, but also he zeroed in on the fact that it's a simple story to tell, but in a big way. And Gassner reflected that with every movie you make with Sam Mendes, it's, quote, like you jump off into the abyss, and as you're following, you just figure it out. Now, when Roger Deakins got hold of the script for the first time, he assumed there was an error on it, as he talked to the New York Times about. Because as Deakins said, Sam Mendes called out the blue, said he was going to be doing something shortly. Could he send me a script? And he said it turned up, and on the front cover it said, this is envisaged as a real-time story shot with a single take. And Deakins said it was a bit of a shock. He didn't assume that was actually the intent, but then he said, I read the script and it seemed like an interesting way to tell the story. It wasn't a tacked on gimmick. And so you've got Gassner and Deakins then trying to work out, how on earth are you going to do this? Well, you needed cast locked in fairly early to be able to plan it for reasons I'll come to shortly. So casting director Nina Gold was looking at hundreds of possibilities for the lead roles, was sending the audition tapes to Sam Mendes as well. And it's 2 young lead male roles that the film was ultimately going to hinge on. And one of the early candidates was Tom Holland. Now, Tom Holland, the incumbent Spider-Man at this point, was said to have been interested, but he had an existing commitment to a project that was in all kinds of trouble. The film adaptation of Patrick Ness's book Chaos Walking that was being directed by Doug Liman. Lionsgate was backing that film and putting, $100 million just into the physical production of it, and Chaos Walking was having problems. It was going to need extensive reshoots as well. And the dates of those reshoots was going to clash with when the film that we ultimately knew as 1917 was going to film. And so it knocked Tom Holland clean out of contention for one of those 2 lead roles. Still, October 2018. So we're now, 3-4 months from when the script sold, when the package was sold to Amblin. We got the news of who the 2 leads were going to be. Dean Charles Chapman was one of them, and someone they weren't aware of, actually, when they started casting. Sam Mendes, I don't think, is a big Game of Thrones fan. I can't speak for him, but that was certainly the implication in some of the interviews he gave at that point. And then the wonderful George Mackay. And in October 2018, we got the news that it was those 2 were going to lead the film. What we didn't know with that announcement was they were pretty much straight away off into a 6-month process just to get ready for it. Now, when the actors were called to audition together in front of Sam Mendes, they were only given 4 or 5 pages of the script itself. There was still a shroud of secrecy over it. And Mackay said to The Hollywood Reporter many months later, we both left that audition kind of going, I can't really tell. I really don't know. But when they got the roles, at first they worked together for a month. And for fairly obvious reasons, they needed to be in tandem with each other, really. Then they went off for a little bit of time to prepare by themselves. And then come the start of 2019, they were back for 3 months of physical and arms training. Now, Dean Charles Chapman would reflect on the actual physical shooting of the film was really difficult. You were carrying heavy equipment. It was a lot of movement as well. So this training was really crucial. But also what they were doing at that point was they were helping to build the film in a way that actors aren't always required to do. That, as Mackay said, you're setting the pace of the film, quite literally in this case. Odd use of literally. Just a bugbear of mine. Not aimed at you, George Mackay, if you're listening. And he said, so if you're not doing the lines in in the way you should be, at the right pace, walking at the right pace, not considering what you're walking through, the set will be the wrong size. So imagine that. You're given this you're given this dialogue to do. You've got to get from A to B. You have to plot out how long it's going to take you to do it, because the production is going to be put together based around how fast you can do it, or what pace you're going to be walking at, where you'll be, where you'll deliver certain lines. As Mackay said, you need to get to the corner at a certain point. And if you race through the scene, you finish the scene way before the corner, and then the whole set is compromised. The preparation on this was pretty intense. I'll come to it again just in a second. By March of 2019, it was still on schedule for a shoot in April of that month. And now DreamWorks was confirming this April start date and the expansion of the cast. And Mark Strong came in, Andrew Scott, Daniel Mays, Richard Madden, Adrian Scarborough, Naban Rizwan, Claire Duperk, Jamie Parker, Colin Firth, Benedict Cumberbatch. A really impressive ensemble of actors. And apparently one of the ways that Sam Mendes managed to recruit them in was to tell them, when it came to the press tour, you're not going to have to do any of the work, that you're in the supporting roles here. And so ordinarily you put you put two big names in the lead roles and unknowns in the supporting. He was pretty much inverting it here. Roger Deakins was confirmed around this point as well, but it's pretty well known by that point he was already working on him. But let's dig back into just the intensity of the pre-production of it, because the mechanics of what Sam Mendes wanted to do were, by this point, his cast and crew were well aware the film was going to be presented as two continuous shots. Lee Smith was brought in as editor early on, again to help plan how they were going to do this. They were also going to be shooting this on location with long shots. That this wasn't a case of you're just going to get 2 seconds of material, then move on. The camera was going to be running for minutes at a time. And this is a World War I film where sequences take place where actors walk through trenches. Well, these trenches didn't exist for the production. They were going to have to dig them from scratch. And the question was, how long do you need to dig them for? Well, the answer to that was determined by how long it would take the actors to say the necessary dialogue to move on to the next part of the film and keep it organic. That they had to walk the film through, really, and the distance they were walking had to be measured so that the production team could work out how big a trench they needed to dig. And in the end, they dug just under a mile of trenches for the film, but these were meticulously worked out. So, like, if you're going to have two actors who are walking for 7-8 minutes in a continuous shot, how much do you need? How much do you need to put in place for the camera to see, for it to look proper, to make it work? And so it was these kind of things. It wasn't just on the trenches either. It was on where the extras need to be, where people need to come in, where things have to be at a certain point, at the moment where the actors get to a certain part on the landscape. All sorts of really mind-boggling things that they needed to work. And then in terms of the equipment to shoot it all, the equipment had to be mobile. Now, if you've seen 1917, then you'll know there are moments where the camera just suddenly lifts out of the trench and it's off across a battlefield, and all of these things had to be worked out. The camera needed to be light. It needed to be able to work on a track, then an operator quickly pick it up and start moving with it. And also it was going to work for pretty much the entire shoot on a single lens, because it had to look continuous right the way through. If you're going to present a film in 2 continuous shots, well, everything had to marry up, and that had to be pre-planned. April 2019, the film did indeed start shooting. The budget around $90 to $100 million, and this wasn't going on hefty salaries or anything like that, really. A lot of it was on the physical production of the film. That they shot bits at Shepperton Studios, but the bulk of it was filmed in Wiltshire and in Scotland. There were environmental concerns they had to deal with the number of people that they were going to have traipsing over the countryside there. And I remember just as the film came out, I went to a Q&A that Sam Mendes and Roger Deakins did for the film. And they talked about being hostage to the variable weather conditions when they were shooting. And Deakins was going for as much natural light as he could use, but also the points where he needed lights, he said he had the biggest lighting rig he'd ever used on a film with over 2,000 individual lamps on it. for the two lead actors as well, George Mackay in particular, the direction given was you keep acting until Sam Mendes calls cut. And these were takes that would go on for like up to 10 minutes or something like that. I mean, there's a moment in the film where he's running across a field with loads of extras and he's just running and running and running to the point where, I mean, he goes full Tom Cruise in a Mission Impossible film, the pace he's going, but he's bumping into one or two people as he goes. And even though it was all intricately planned, I mean, he couldn't help but bump into people. But the words of Sam Mendes were in his ears, "You don't stop acting until I shout cut." So he didn't mean to bump into them, but he picked himself up and kept going. And Mendes and Deakin shot this and included moments like that in the film as well. There were lots and lots of potential pitfalls here that, I mean, when an explosion went off, it had to go off at just the right point or the whole shot was ruined and they had to reset up to 10 minutes of filming as well. I should point out as well, actually, Christy Wilson Cairns would heavily praise how George Mackay treated people on the set of the film, about how he got to know everybody and would shake their hands and thank them an awful lot. I love little human things like that. They also had to be relatively nimble with the shoot as well, because they were shooting outside in the UK, and you don't need me, if you live in the UK, to tell you that the weather can be variable and not reliable. So they had to have different rigs on standby. They had to be adaptable to what they needed to shoot at times if the weather offered certain opportunities. Now, the problem that they had actually across the 65-day shoot was the weather, if anything, was too good. They could have used a few more clouds. And, you know, they had sequences at hand sometimes that required, I think it was up to 500 extras at one point. And these extras were being individually handpicked by Mendes to make sure that they looked right. And all of these moving parts in individual long shots as well. I mean, Mendes would talk about this to Variety. He said there'd be times when you get 7 minutes into the take and someone would trip or a bit of mud would get on the lens or an explosive device would be off and you just can't use the take. He said the acting could be wonderful and everything else could be right and you'd have to start again. In terms of getting the continuity right as well, Lee Smith would be assembling a cut of the film from every single day of the material shot that day. So these are dailies. This is not uncommon. But what was different here is Sam Mendes was having to choose the shot that was going to be in the film on the spot at the end of each shooting day. The reason being is they needed to know what the shot was so that when they moved on to the next day's filming, it could exactly match up to the shot that Sam Mendes had picked to go into the film. Decisions were being made on a daily basis that ordinarily would be left to the post-production period of the film, but it had to glue together. This was not the usual way to do a film. They were having to change the rule book, really, in order to make all of this work. Now, on the plus side, what that meant was, in the end, when production did in the end wrap up, the editing of it would be faster than you might ordinarily expect, because a lot of those editing decisions had already been made that Lee Smith, in assembling the final cut of the film, appreciating Thomas Newman had to come in and put his score in and things like that, and there's also some visual effects work I'll just come to in a second. The core of the film had been built in the preparation, and a lot of the choices had been made during the shoot of the movie. Now, this didn't mean that Lee Smith didn't have a challenge, because I don't know if any of you have seen the Brian De Palma movie Snake Eyes, starring Nicolas Cage. Snake Eyes opens with an incredible 10-11 minute shot of which looks like a continual single shot. And if you go on YouTube, there's a terrific video that breaks down where all the invisible cuts are in Snake Eyes. Now, Snake Eyes was shot on film, so you could capture 10-11 minutes in a single film magazine at a time. 1917 was shot on digital, so the shots could go on for a lot longer. But there was a real art demonstrated in Snake Eyes to how to hide a cut in absolute plain view. Lee Smith had this down to an absolute snip, that the shortest individual cut in the final reels of 1917 runs for 39 seconds. That is it. If you picture an action sequence in a big movie, you get individual shots which are half a second, if that. The shortest cut was 39 seconds long. And so what Mendes wanted was for the film to run for pretty much an hour, then to have a pause and then switch to a different look. So he allowed us as an audience to see one cut as it were. For Lee Smith, he had to put it together so that it looked like that was all we were getting, when actually right throughout the film, I think there's fewer than 50 edits in the final cut that we see, but still those had to be disguised, because to audience members we see one, and so for everyone else, well, for the editing team, they're having to hide 48, 49 individual edits just to make sure it looks as clear as Sam Mendes wanted it to look. The digital effects work was not, great big alien spaceships or anything like that. In fact, one of the bits of digital effects work was putting maggots on someone's face. That'll put you off your breakfast, right? That they had to shoot them against a bit of blue screen and just digitally insert them onto an actor. That's cheery as well. But just because the post-production was, I'm loath to say simple, but I will go with probably the shortest part of the production, it didn't mean it was without challenges, that it would be an absolute race to the finish to get the film ready in time for the planned release date. That what was going to happen this time was Universal was going to put the film out and Entertainment One was going to put the film out in the UK, and the release date was set for the start of December 2019. Now, the thinking was that this would be the last possible entrant into the 2020 Oscar race, that by the 92nd Academy Awards, I mean, all the contenders really had pretty much been shown by the point 1917 debuted for the first time. And so we're talking about films like Parasite and The Irishman and Jojo Rabbit, Joker, Little Women, Marriage Story, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. These were the big favourites for the Oscars. And so, I mean, the general feeling was you release a film in December, that's too late to catch the Oscars, surely. In the case of Spectre, Sam Mendes memorably completed his final cut of that just like a day or two before the first press screening of the film. In the case of 1917, the first public screening of the film took place at the Directors Guild of America in New York on November the 23rd. Sam Mendes locked his final cut of the film on November the 17th. And so an absolute race to the finish line again, and then it got its wide release in the UK. Well, it got its first release in the UK wide in London on the 4th of December 2019 before it got its UK release at the start of January. How would it go though? What would the response be? Well, the response was pretty much ecstatic. That there were one or two critics who took against almost like what they saw as the gimmicky single shot approach, and in fact poked holes in the fact and said it's not a single shot, and had some argument with it. Those who went with it absolutely loved it, and I think the majority of people absolutely went with it. That the technical achievement of the movie came in for particular praise, but also just what it did for a piece of drama, allowing you to follow just these two young men in the midst of horrific warfare, and just a different way of telling that story. And I mean, the praise for it was raining in, and it was a feeling that this is the film that's absolutely crashed the Oscar race at the last possible minute. What wasn't expected to the same degree, I don't think, is what it would do at the box office. Because, I mean, in America, for instance, it came out on Christmas Day, just in time to qualify for the Academy Awards, and it got an 11 screen release on the weekend of December the 27th to the 29th, where, 1917 opened with an incredible screen average. So it opened in 16th place, but with $500,000 in the bank. And the screen average over its first week was coming in at $52,000. There was nothing on the chart that was anywhere near that. That Just Mercy opened up on 4 screens, screen average of $26,000. Clemency, 1 screen average of $17,000. But if you go to the top of the chart, the one that was leading the way was Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker, which grossed $72 million, but on a screen average of $16,000. 1917 was a film that people were desperately keen to see, and so what happened in the US? Universal just held it on those 11 screens for another week, and the screen average went up That doesn't happen often. $56,000 at the screen average. It had made $2.3 million in 2 weeks on just 11 screens. And, I mean, there was a degree of hot potato about this. What would it do when they expanded it the following week to 3,500 screens, just shy? Well, 1917 grossed $37 million. $37 million for a non-star-led World War I film. And this was a big hit. It knocked Star Wars Episode 9 off the top of the chart. It knocked Jumanji: The Next Level down as well. The other opener that week, when 1917 finally stormed the charts, was Like a Boss, opened with $10 million, nowhere near it. Underwater opened $7 million. Underrated movie, Underwater, I'd just say. 1917, though, was doing great business. And in fact, it was down to second place on its fourth week of release, but grossing another $21 million as Bad Boys for Life knocked it off the top of the chart and Doolittle came along. But Doolittle was on 21.8, 1917 was on 21.9. Inside a month, this small film, as originally conceived, was closing in on $100 million in the US. It got there on its fifth week of release as films like The Gentleman and The Turning didn't manage to knock it down the chart. And it was being powered as well by a lot of momentum towards the Academy Awards, where it was duly nominated for Best Picture and also was nominated for a whole bunch of other Oscars as well, for Best Director, for Best Original Screenplay, for Best Cinematography, for Makeup and Hairstyling, for Score, Production Design, Sound Editing, Sound Mixing, Visual Effects. The awards were coming in, left, right and centre really at this point. It was picking up loads of nominations. I think I read somewhere Roger Deakins alone picked up 30, 40 award nominations just for 1917. Now, when it did finally get to the Academy Awards, which took place on the 9th of February 2020, it didn't win the big prize. Deakins won, and the sound mixing and the visual effects also won. 3 Academy Awards it took home in the end, as Parasite took the top prize. But by the time 1917 left cinemas around the world, it had grossed an incredible $384 million. So that's $159 million in the US, 225 outside of the US. And, what's interesting is this was the end of 2019, the start of 2020. So Bad Boys for Life came out and was a hit in early 2020. The Invisible Man was just becoming a hit. And then all the lockdowns came in. The pandemic hit us. Lovely. And, 1917, in the UK at least, was the last big hit movie for, a year and a half. And it just stood tall, really. It came out on DVD and Blu-ray, and at a point where physical media was said to be in decline. Cleaned up a lot of money there as well. And, it's quite telling, too, that no one's really tackled anything quite like it since. It's still a popular film. It's still a popular film on rotation as well. Sam Mendes would go on to... the film he would do afterwards would be a very personal one, which didn't quite click in the same way, 2022's Empire of Light. But at the point this is being recorded, well, he is about to start work on 4 different biopic movies of the individual Beatles, Paul McCartney, John Lennon, Ringo Starr and George Harrison, all set for release in 2027. None of those are expected to be single-shot movies, we should point out. 1917, though, was conceived, partly as a result of a James Bond film, partly in a space where he had the time to stop and think as much as you can after you've just had a new child. But also, it was an absolute gamble, an absolute risk. And one of the last times, really, something of its ilk paid off so spectacularly, both in terms of box office and in terms of acclaim. 1917, then. Not a bad movie, is it?
Look around. You can find cars like these on AutoTrader. Like that car riding your tail. Or if you're tailgating right now, all those cars doubling as kitchens and living rooms are on AutoTrader, too. Are you working out and listening to this ad at the same time? Well, multitasking pro, cars like the ones in the gym parking lot are for sale on AutoTrader. New cars, used cars, electric cars, maybe even flying cars. Okay, no flying cars, but as soon as they get invented, they'll be on AutoTrader. Just you wait. AutoTrader.
And that brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening and thank you for your time. I'm on to the parish notices bit. Couple of ways you can support this podcast, for instance. Apart from lending it your ears, I'm very grateful you lend it your ears. Thank you so much for doing that. If you like it so much you want to put money in the tin here and help us do lots of things, if you go to patreon.com/SimonBrew, put some money in there. In return, you get the podcast early pretty much every week. You get it ad-free as well. You find out gossip of what we're up to behind the scenes. You'll find all of that. Patreon.com/SimonBrew. If you subscribe, it costs you nothing to subscribe to this podcast at your podcast home of choice. That kind of thing really helps with algorithms and stuff like that for small independent podcasts like this. Thank you so much to everyone who's done that. And likewise, if you can leave ideally a hugely positive review, that helps too. It's probably not escaped your attention that the majority of podcasts now have lots of famous people involved. I am not a famous person. I'm a boring person who lives in the West Midlands and waffles into a mic. If you leave reviews, if you subscribe, that gives me just some kind of fighting chance against the swathe of really important celebrity people, of which I am not one. I also do independent print magazines. I must be mad. I also do independent print magazines that are, I've just published issue 50 of Film Stories magazine, which leads with a huge exclusive William Shatner interview. The stuff he says about refusing to re-edit Star Trek V and about having tarantulas on his face. A real joy that was. He rang the West Midlands for us to have that chat. Bizarre. A pinch yourself moment. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, it's the UK's biggest film magazine, 168 pages. Really, really, really big. And that's for sale there. You have to primarily get my magazine's mail order. Likewise, Film Junior, issue 17, the only print film magazine that I know of for young film fans. They also write parts of it as well, and they get paid to write it as well. If you can support that, that helps so much. store.filmstories.co.uk. But now I'm going to move on. It's enough parish notices, right? I'm going to move on to the second of the two films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. We're going to 2016. We're doing a bit of a literary adaptation here. I'll play you a clip from the trailer. We'll get on the train, come to the story, the other side of this.
I used to watch this perfect couple. They were the embodiment of true love. I want to start my life over again. I saw her. I saw her from the train. She was with this man. Just for a second. Somewhere far along this road, is this her? To a woman so heartless.
Can you tell me where you were Friday night?
I was in the city, and then I went to visit my husband.
You mean your ex-husband? It's my understanding that the woman who has gone missing was his nanny.
Hey, Tom.
Hey, Megan.
That then was a clip from the 2016 big screen adaptation of The Girl on the Train. Directed by Tate Taylor, screenplay by Erin Cressida Wilson, based on the novel The Girl on the Train by Paula Hawkins, and starring Emily Blunt, Rebecca Ferguson, Hayley Bennett, Justin Theroux, Luke Evans, Alison Janney, Edgar Ramirez and Lisa Kudrow. So, Gone Girl. Let's start with Gone Girl, particularly the film adaptation of Gone Girl in 2014, directed by David Fincher, also the huge success of the novel. And, it was just a perfect storm, really, and Hollywood suddenly had a taste for literary adaptations that were also female-driven thrillers, and this was the latest fad. So, it was a case of tearing through all the manuscripts that were out there of unpublished books and seeing if there's anything else that might fit that kind of Gone Girl kind of model. And so it was, there were studio readers who were just poring over books, and it was DreamWorks, two of those, this episode, that thought it had found something when it got hold of a pre-release copy of The Girl on the Train, written by British author Paula Hawkins. And, it got hold of that book, I think it was 2014, and snapped up the screen rights to do it with the intention of giving it to producer Mark Platt, that Platt would then be charged with getting the film to the screen quickly, and spoiler, this he duly did. So the book was duly released in 2015 and became the hoped-for sensation. It spent 20 weeks at the top of the bestsellers chart, breaking a record set by Dan Brown, imagine. And Paula Hawkins, to get to that point, had gambled really hard, actually, on the jump to fiction writing. That her background was as a financial journalist, and she borrowed money to get the time just to write the book. As she explained to The Guardian, at the point The Girl on the Train was published, if this didn't work, I was either going to have to go back to being a journalist, terrible, or come up with something completely new to do. And she said it was the last chance. Now, the novel would be described as the fastest selling adult, not like that, novel in US literary history. And Hawkins would play down comments such as that. She was wisely stepping away from the hype in a lot of the interviews that she gave. And also, she wasn't a new novel writer, that she'd written romance novels under a different name, Amy Silver. And she admitted she'd been commissioned to do these. These hadn't necessarily come directly from her heart. And they weren't really the kind of books that she personally go to read by choice. And so she wrote 4 Amy Silver books in the end and acknowledged that they were getting darker as the subject matter went towards material that interested her more. The problem being these were supposed to be fluffy romancy books, and the darker they got, the commercial prospects of them started to taper off a little bit. They started doing less well. And she got to a point where she had to take a leap. And going back to The Guardian, she said she was just starting to panic. She said, I don't have a partner, so I take care of the mortgage by myself. And I was thinking, oh God, I'm going to have to sell the house or find a new career. And she described this period of her life as not being in a good place, but treating it as, quote, a real spur to get The Girl on the Train right. She said, I had to nail it and do it really well. It really concentrates the mind, that kind of thing. And that 6 months where she was writing it, she said, I didn't really do anything else. She was borrowing money from her dad, which she didn't want to do at all. But she got the book written, and then it was a fairly quick path after that to it starting to take off, and obviously studios getting interested in it. So it came time to get the book adapted to the screen, and DreamWorks and Mark Platt found a screenwriter, Erin Cressida Wilson, and her calling card is the brilliant 2002 film Secretary, which I've covered before on this podcast. And so she was commissioned to write the script, to write the adaptation of The Girl on the Train, and it was her that made an early decision to relocate the story, that the book is set on a train journey into London and London's Euston Station. If anyone uses London Euston Station, by the way, let me tell you, this is the station where they've taken out the main departure board so they can put a big advertising billboard there in place and instead put smaller departure boards. It's a great commercial decision, brilliant to whoever's running London Euston Station. That is a slight aside. The decision was made to relocate to New York, that Wilson argued that the commuter trains running along the north side of New York went past neighbourhoods that were very, very posh with very big houses, and she just thought that and a train into Grand Central Station in New York, where to my knowledge they have not taken the departure boards out and replaced them with big advertising hoardings, was probably the best way forward. And so that decision was made, and in early 2015 the script was very much coming together, and the search was on for a director. Again, I've done this podcast for many, many years, and there are a few stories where the script came together quickly and the director came together quickly, but here we are. Tate Taylor had enjoyed success with a film that's divisive now, The Help. There was pushback at the time, but particularly now. Oscar-winning movie, The Help, but had helped really put him on the map. He'd been making the biopic of James Brown as well, Get On Up, starring the late, great Chadwick Boseman. And he was sounded out about doing The Girl on the Train, and as he explained to the Flickering Myth website, he said, I'm interested, and I had a meeting the next week and said what I would do with the material. And he had lines really on this, because he just said the movie had to be dark and you had to lean into the violence and to the sex, because neither is gratuitous and they're both important to the characters. And the studio agreed. And Tate Taylor said, this has to be an R-rated film. We will really let readers down if we try to back away from that. And so this was in June of 2015. But again, Gone Girl had done some of the pathfinding the year before. Gone Girl had proven you could have an R-rated movie which still had very edgy stuff in it, and the audience would nonetheless turn up. A year later, we would get the 50 Shades of Grey movie, which showed you can put pretty much anything into a movie and people would turn up. 50 Shades of Grey had been a publishing phenomenon by this point as well. And there was a feeling that this was a subset of fiction that could cross over into movies. That 50 Shades of Grey film would already been earmarked for February of 2016. They were going to do 3 of those. The Girl on the Train just was in the slipstream of Gone Girl's release and the commission of 50 Shades of Grey as well. And so it was casting time. And in June of 2015 came the news that Emily Blunt was now in pole position for the lead role in the film. Now, if you're not familiar with the book and you're not familiar with the film, there is, I'm going to spoil a lot as I can, there's a real unreliable narrator quality to it, in that it is a woman on a train who just sees a snapshot of something that's going on twice a day, but also she's battling her own demons, that the central character is alcoholic as well. And I mean, Emily Blunt would have to portray an unreliable central character in the lead role of a movie, which, I mean, we don't get many of those anyway, but certainly this would be a step up just in terms of Emily Blunt carrying a movie on her shoulders. Now, Rebecca Ferguson had already been talked about when Tate Taylor signed up to direct the film. In fact, the script and the change of location was already done when Tate Taylor signed up to direct as well. And Emily Blunt was being talked about as well. But she talked in an interview with the Refinery 29 website, she said, I hadn't read the book when I got approached about it. I'd just seen everyone reading the book on vacation or on the subway, the train. So when I was approached, I read it and very quickly saw why it was this phenomenon. And it really was a phenomenon as well. And Emily Blunt's career, I mean, she'd enjoyed success to this point. That's the film Sicario was about to be released, actually. So she got some recognition that was on the way too. You wouldn't call her at that point in her career a full-on movie star, but still, she'd been award nominated for Into the Woods the year before, for instance. Strong notices in the co-lead role of the Tom Cruise headline, Edge of Tomorrow, or Live, Die, Repeat, depending who you're talking to. Blunt was just about big enough for the studio, and it would be Universal that would distribute this in the US, to sign off on her. That the film wasn't going to cost an enormous amount of money in terms of Hollywood studio expense. Still, they needed a name, but they knew they weren't going to get like a $20 million lead for it. But they wanted someone who could act. They wanted someone who could do this character justice as well, who fit. And Emily Blunt just seemed to fit the whole thing. The right actor at the right time in the right role. And it was a jump up for her. It was the first time she was headlining a major movie solo. The film was going to cost about $45 million for the narrative, but it already had that built-in profile as well as a result of the book. And so the momentum was building. I mean, the cast was coming together at speed. Hayley Bennett, Rebecca Ferguson were going to take the lead roles. That was announced in August of 2015. By September 2015, Jared Leto and Chris Evans were being linked with the lead male roles in the movie. But scheduling problems would tragically cost the film another Jared Leto performance. Imagine that. And also scheduling knocked Chris Evans and his jumper collection out of contention for the film as well, which is why Justin Theroux and Luke Evans would take their places. By October, we had Edgar Ramirez and the wonderful Alison Janney as well. Kate Mara had been linked with the film at one point, but it was not to be for reasons I couldn't quite get to the bottom of. But even as this cast was coming together, Emily Blunt was throwing herself into preparation. She was meeting addicts. She was watching a lot of episodes of a TV show by the name of Intervention as well. And she was just trying to get to the heart of... I mean, to be fair, I see people in interviews a lot of the time talking about complex characters, but this is a really complex character, and she was determined to get her head into it. She was also going to keep her British accent, which there wasn't a lot of argument over, but it was decided fairly quickly that that was going to be the case. And this was slightly a nod too to the fact that the original text of the Girl on the Train was set in Britain, was written by a British author as well. But also Tate Taylor, who wanted her to keep her British accent, liked the idea that it just set her as a bit more of an outsider as well in New York. By December 2015, I mean, the original distributor was going to be Disney again, but, DreamWorks deals and such like. And so Universal was going to be taking over on that, and this was thanks to the distribution deal that it had done with Amblin. The Girl on the Train was the first to be released under this new partnership that they put together with Universal and Amblin. And so the idea then was the film was going to be released on October the 7th, 2016. That this had originally been announced by Disney. Now Universal was going to hold that release date as well. One person who was watching all this from the sidelines was Paula Hawkins, that she was pretty hands-off with the movie, and she did say, I basically handed it over and everybody just got on with it. That she told a story of how Tate Taylor originally came to London and the pair of them went for a drink, and Hawkins was happy that she saw from what he was saying that he had an idea for it and what he wanted to do with it. And she said, I was thinking he sees the same things in it that I see. He wanted it to be very dark from the start. And Hawkins admitted she had the concern that a filmmaker might want to come to her story and take some of that innate darkness out of it. That was not going to be the case. November 2015 then, this fast-tracked film was already before the cameras. So, I mean, just assess where we've got to. The book was optioned in 2014, published in 2015. The script was being put together at the start of 2015. The director didn't come in for a few months into the year. The casting was coming together in the middle of the year. This was a production going at pace. And Emily Blunt talked about the challenge, actually, just in the presentation of her character, the makeup challenge, for instance, of how do you get across visually that her character was worse the wear for drink? What does that do to your skin, she argued? What did they do? What does that do to your eyes? And they put a kind of grey hue to her skin, and they said they brought out every blemish I had. And she said, for the really drunk stuff, I wore full contact lenses, so I had a full bloodshot eye that covered her whole eye. And she said it was a pain in the ass to wear, but it gives that sort of glassy eye feel. But she also reconciled that throughout the film, I had different stages of drunkenness, so there were different contact lenses to reflect that. She had pink eyes, red eyes, yellow hungover eyes, and a lot of the time that she was having to be acting with the discomfort of these lenses in. It's also worth noting as well, I mean, the film would shoot in New York, but she was pregnant with her second child during the shooting of the film too. So an added challenge just to keep her on her toes there as well. The shoot primarily just stuck to New York. It was done and dusted by the end of January 2016. Paula Hawkins had come along and done a little bit of, just shot a small cameo in the film, which was chopped out by the time we finally got to see it as well. But the post-production of it was fairly quiet, fairly straightforward. That Michael McCusker and Andrew Buckland did the edit of the film. Danny Elfman came in to do the score of it. And in terms of the promotion of it, well, the film was, the trailer went down really rather well. And the premiere of the movie was set for the autumn of 2016. That the premiere would take place actually in London at the Odeon Leicester Square, September the 20th, 2016. With the full release following a week or two later. It wouldn't actually turn up in the US until the middle of October. And so this was a big studio film that we were getting in the UK first. Well, what was the response to it? Glad you asked that. The response was all right. It was all right. That inevitably it was being compared to Gone Girl, and the comparison was not a favourable one. One person who did really well out of the reviews was Emily Blunt. Her performance was pretty much acknowledged across the board, something that really lifted the film. But the film itself, well, just fine, all right. Not that much suspense, little bit flat, fine, it'll do. That kind of level of response to it. Still, would it make a lot of money? Well, it didn't do too badly at all, as it happened. Let's jump to the American release, which was a couple of weeks later. So October the 7th to the 9th was the first weekend it was out in the US, and there it was, top of the chart, $24.5 million, and heading up the box office, knocking Tim Burton's underrated and overlooked, actually, Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. I really like that film. Goes on too long, but I think that's one of his better, more recent movies. Deepwater Horizon had come out the week before as well, so Miss Peregrine was on 15 million, Deepwater on 11 million. The remake of The Magnificent Seven was in fourth place. Stork was in fifth. The Birth of the Nation movie, the newer version of that, was released that week as well. 7 million opening weekend. Middle School, The Worst Years of My Life, Sully, Masterminds, Queen of Catway. These were the kind of things it was up against. But, I mean, just putting The Girl on the Train sat next to Gone Girl for a minute. Gone Girl's opening weekend, which was the yardstick it was being measured against, was in the similar release time frame, 37 million. So The Girl on the Train was below. I mean, notably below. The following week, well, it didn't hold the top spot. It lost half of its business. Not too bad, but that's all right. 12 million for its second weekend. Ben Affleck as The Accountant. They're just shooting a sequel to that as I'm recording this. Opened with 24.7 million. And so The Girl on the Train was fairly quickly going out of the chart from that point onwards. By week 3, we got Boo, A Medea, Halloween, Jack Reacher, Never Go Back, Ouija, Origin of Evil. So Girl on the Train was in 5th, 7 million on its third weekend. The word of mouth was not working in its favour. That much would be fair to say. And so it hung around for a little bit, but by the time it left US cinemas, it had 75.3 million in the bank. Overseas, it had 97.7 million in the bank. The overall total for it at cinemas, 173.2 million, which for a $50 million movie that nearly starred Jared Leto in a supporting role really isn't too shabby. But in the modern world of movies, where studios are looking for billions upon billions, perhaps something that was a little bit sniffed at. What the film didn't get was an awful lot of attention from awards either. That the BAFTAs nominated Emily Blunt for Best Actress, nowhere near the Oscars. I mean, it wasn't getting the acclaim of Gone Girl. And so there just wasn't an awful lot to it beyond that point, really. And so The Girl on the Train came in 2016 and went in 2016. For Paula Hawkins, she would go on to, she'd go on to do a couple more thrillers and continues to write thrillers now. And so she's got one or two more that are on the cooker, on the stove, really, for coming back to the cinema screen. The Girl on the Train, though, was a prescient capture, really, for DreamWorks. Saw the book early, released and snapped up the screen rights before they got really expensive, when loads of people had seen it. And you know what? Full credit to Paula Hawkins. She took an absolute gamble with her career. She took the risk, and it paid off. The film might not have come out as all had hoped. The book, you can't really argue with. And that brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening, and thank you for your time. If I've not bored you completely, I'm on Twitter and Blue Sky at Simon Brew, and Film Stories is on Twitter and Blue Sky at Film Stories. You can find more from the Film Stories project at Facebook as well, facebook.com/Film Stories online, Film Stories Magazine UK on Instagram. What else are we on? TikTok, we're on that. Have a search for Film Stories on there. You can get us on youtube.com/Film Stories. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, that is our online store. You can buy all of our print magazines apart from the ones that are sold out. You can buy all of our UK produced Blu-rays with fresh extras apart from the ones that are sold out. And if you go to filmstories.co.uk, that is our entertainment website that doesn't do clickbait. Imagine that. No, you're not getting a website that's got 54,000 pop-ups, that wants to know your location, that wants to know your shoe size. It is an entertainment website done slightly more the old way. It's really hard to get that to cut through. Any support you give us is much appreciated. And if you want to see me live, go to macbirmingham.co.uk and search for Movie Geek Live. My show there is on the 19th of June 2024. Hopefully you're getting that in time. Tickets for that are on sale now. But, as always, I've outstayed my welcome and I've bored you too much. So I'm going to leave you in peace. I'm going to wish you well. The main thing, as always, is you all stay well and healthy. And I will be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.